The neon sign of the Port Authority bus terminal flickered, casting a sickly green glow over the damp pavement. It was 11:45 p.m. in midwinter, New York City. The air smelled of diesel exhaust and old regrets. Sarah adjusted her backpack, her fingers numb from the biting wind. She was the only one waiting at gate 42. Most people were already home, tucked under warm blankets, oblivious to the shadows stretching across the linoleum floor. She checked her watch. The last bus to her small town in Pennsylvania was late. Usually the city never sleeps, but tonight the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. She didn't know that tonight the bus wouldn't just be taking her home, it would be taking her into a nightmare.
A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards before she saw the headlights. A battered silver-gray coach pulled up to the gate. The doors creaked open with a hiss of pneumatic air that sounded like a dying gasp. The driver didn't look up. He sat hunched over the wheel, his face obscured by the shadow of a low-brimmed cap. Sarah stepped inside, the heat of the bus clashing with the freezing air. It felt stifling, smelling of stale tobacco and something metallic like copper. She handed over her ticket, but the driver's gloved hand just swiped it without a word. As she walked down the narrow aisle, she noticed something chilling. The bus was empty, completely empty.
Sarah chose a seat halfway down, near the emergency exit. She liked the window seat. It gave her a sense of escape. As the bus pulled out of the terminal, the city lights began to blur into long, distorted streaks of yellow and red. She leaned her head against the cold glass, trying to close her eyes. But the vibration of the engine felt wrong. It was uneven, like a heartbeat skipping a beat. Every time they passed a street lamp, a flash of light would illuminate the interior. For a split second, she thought she saw a reflection in the driver's rearview mirror. Not the driver's eyes, but someone else's, someone sitting in the very back row. She froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She slowly turned her head, peering into the darkness of the rear seats. Nothing. Just empty blue fabric and the shadows of the overhead luggage racks. She told herself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on her mind. She turned back to the window, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It intensified. It felt like a physical weight pressing against the back of her neck. Outside, the urban sprawl was giving way to the dark skeletal trees of the New Jersey Turnpike. The bus was picking up speed now, far faster than the legal limit. The scenery was nothing but a black void.
"Excuse me?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling more than she intended. "Is the heater on? It's getting a bit cold back here." The driver didn't respond. He didn't even shift in his seat. The bus hit a pothole, sending a violent jolt through the frame, but the driver kept his hands perfectly still on the wheel. Sarah stood up slightly to get a better look at him. That's when she noticed the GPS on the dashboard.
It wasn't pointing toward the highway to Pennsylvania. The blue line on the screen was heading straight into the deep, unmapped woods of the pine barrens. They had missed the turnoff 5 miles ago. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Sir, you missed the exit for Route 22, she said, louder this time. She began to walk toward the front of the bus, holding on to the headrests for balance. The interior lights suddenly flickered and died, plunging the cabin into total darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the dashboard. As she reached the front row, she looked at the driver's side mirror. Her blood turned to ice. In the reflection, she could finally see the driver's face clearly. It wasn't a face she recognized. It was a face from a missing persons poster she had seen at the station. The man behind the wheel wasn't a bus driver. He was wearing a stolen uniform that was 2 sizes too big. The fabric bunched up at his shoulders. He finally turned his head to look at her. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and devoid of any humanity. He didn't say a word, he just smiled, revealing teeth that were jagged and broken. Sarah backed away, her hand searching for the door lever, but there was nothing there. The manual emergency release had been removed. She was trapped in a high-speed metal cage with a man who wasn't supposed to be alive. And then the bus began to slow down in the middle of nowhere. The bus pulled onto a dirt shoulder, the tires crunching over dry leaves and gravel. The engine groaned and finally cut out, leaving a silence so profound it felt loud. The driver stood up, his tall, lanky frame unfolding like a rusted lawn chair. He blocked the only aisle. Sarah retreated toward the back, her mind racing. She reached into her pocket for her phone, but her fingers found nothing. Her bag, she had left her backpack in the seat. The driver reached down and picked it up. He held it to his face, inhaling deeply, a low guttural hum vibrating in his chest. "Sarah," he whispered. The sound of her name coming from his mouth felt like a violation. How did he know her name? She hadn't spoken to anyone. Then she remembered her luggage tag. He dropped the bag and took a step toward her. The floorboards creaked under his weight. Sarah retreated further, her back eventually hitting the cold metal of the rear engine cover. There was nowhere left to run. She looked at the emergency exit window next to her. It was her only hope, but the latch was rusted shut. Outside, the woods were an impenetrable wall of black. No cars, no lights, just the predator and his prey. The man stopped 3 feet away from her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver object. At first, Sarah thought it was a knife, but as the moonlight hit it, she saw it was a locket she recognized. It belonged to her sister, who had disappeared on this same route 3 years ago. The police had called it a runaway case, but Sarah never believed them. The man opened the locket, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. "She tasted like summer," he rasped. The horror of the realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was a hunt. The locket dangled from his calloused fingers, swaying like a pendulum. Sarah's vision blurred with tears of rage and absolute terror. That locket hadn't been seen since the day her sister, Emily, vanished from a bus stop just like this one. The driver's eyes crinkled at the corners, a mockery of a grandfatherly smile. "She cried for you, you know," he said, his voice a dry rasp, like sandpaper on wood. "At the very end, she whispered your name. I promised her I'd find you. I'm a man of my word, Sarah." He took another step, the heavy scent of grease and decay following him. He wasn't just a killer, he was a collector of broken families. Sarah didn't wait for him to reach her. With a scream that tore through the silence of the woods, she grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the side panel. She swung it with every ounce of strength she had left. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He didn't fall. He stumbled back, his hand clutching his ear as blood began to seep through his fingers. His expression shifted from calm malice to animalistic fury. Sarah scrambled toward the back window, pulling the red emergency handle with all her might. The glass didn't shatter, but it creaked. She was running out of time. The man let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound no human should be able to make. He didn't rush her this time. He moved with a slow, predatory confidence. He knew there was nowhere for her to go. "The windows are reinforced, Sarah," he whispered, wiping blood across his cheek. "I prepared this bus just for tonight. No one hears, no one sees, and no one stops." He reached into his oversized jacket and pulled out a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a pair of industrial zip ties. The sound of the tape being ripped, a sharp, rhythmic zzzt, echoed in the hollow cabin of the bus. Desperation gave her a sudden spark of clarity. Sarah remembered the small pocket knife her father had given her, tucked into the hidden compartment of her boot. As the man lunged, she dropped to the floor, narrowly avoiding his grasp. She fumbled with her laces, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst through her chest. The driver grabbed her hair, jerking her head back. She cried out in pain, but her hand finally closed around the cold steel of the blade. Just as he leaned in to press the tape over her mouth, she drove the knife upward, aiming for anything she could hit. The blade sank into his shoulder. He howled, releasing his grip for a split second. Sarah kicked him in the chest, pushing herself toward the driver's seat. If she could just get to the controls, the door lever. She scrambled over the gear shift, her hands slick with her own sweat and his blood. She found the lever and yanked it. The front doors hissed and swung open. The freezing night air rushed in, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. She leaped from the stairs, hitting the gravel hard, the impact jolting her teeth. She didn't look back. She just ran into the dark, suffocating embrace of the woods. The forest was a maze of skeletal branches that clawed at her clothes and skin. Sarah could hear him behind her, the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots on the forest floor. He wasn't running, he was tracking. He knew these woods better than she did. Every time she thought she had gained distance, she heard a branch snap or a low whistle behind her. It was a game to him, a sick, twisted sport. The moonlight was her only friend, casting long, deceptive shadows that made every tree look like a man waiting to grab her. Then she saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. She ran toward the light, her lungs burning, her legs feeling like lead. Was it a house, a ranger station? As she got closer, her hope withered. It wasn't a house. It was an old, rusted-out school bus, half buried in the dirt and overgrown with vines. Several other vehicles were scattered around it, cars from the 90s, a motorcycle, and another commercial coach. This was a graveyard for the vehicles of people who had gone missing over the last decade. And in the center of the clearing, a small campfire was burning, as if someone was waiting for her arrival. Sarah stopped at the edge of the clearing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Beside the fire sat a small wooden chair, and on that chair was a backpack. Her heart stopped. It was her sister's backpack, the one with the faded butterfly patch. It looked brand new, as if it had been cared for with obsessive precision. Suddenly, the whistling stopped. The silence of the woods became absolute. A voice came from the darkness behind her, but it wasn't the driver's voice. It was softer, higher, and chillingly familiar. "You're late for dinner, Sarah," the voice whispered from the shadows of the rusted school bus. Sarah spun around, her knife held out with trembling hands. Emerging from the wreckage of the old bus was a woman. Her hair was matted, her clothes were rags, and her skin was pale as bone. But it was the eyes, wide and vacant, that broke Sarah's heart. "Emily," she breathed. The woman didn't move. She just stared through Sarah, as if looking at someone who wasn't there. Behind the woman, the tall, hulking figure of the driver appeared. He placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, and she didn't flinch. She leaned into him. He hadn't just taken her sister. He had broken her. The driver looked at Sarah, a triumphant glint in his eyes. "Family should be together," he said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing tone that was more terrifying than his anger. He handed a long, rusted blade to Emily. Sarah's sister took it, her fingers wrapping around the hilt with mechanical precision. "Show her, Emily," the man commanded. "Show her what happens to people who try to leave the last bus ride." Emily took a step toward Sarah, the blade reflecting the orange glow of the campfire. Sarah realized then that the monster wasn't just the man, it was the madness he had created. And her sister was holding the knife. Emily's eyes were like two hollow craters, reflecting the dancing flames of the campfire. She took another step towards Sarah, the rusted blade trembling in her hand. "Emily, it's me," Sarah sobbed, her voice cracking. "It's Sarah. Remember the summer at the lake? Remember the song Mom used to sing?" For a fleeting second, the vacancy in Emily's eyes flickered. A shadow of a memory crossed her face, and her grip on the knife loosened. But the man behind her noticed. He placed his heavy, gloved hands on her shoulders, leaning down to whisper into her ear. His words were low, a poisonous honey that seemed to paralyze Emily's will once again. "She's not your sister anymore, Sarah," the man said, looking over Emily's head at his new prey. "She belongs to the road now. We all do. This bus, these woods, this is the only home that matters." He squeezed Emily's shoulders, and her face went blank again, the mask of a doll returning. Sarah realized with a sickening jolt that this man hadn't just kidnapped her sister, he had rebuilt her mind. He was a cult of one, and he was using Emily as a weapon. Sarah backed away, her heel catching on a rusted piece of metal, a discarded license plate from a state hundreds of miles away. The clearing was filled with the ghosts of the missing. As Sarah retreated, she saw more than just cars. She saw personal belongings, a child's shoe, a half-burnt diary, a set of keys with a "World's Best Dad" keychain. This wasn't just a graveyard for vehicles, it was a trophy room of stolen lives. The driver began to whistle a low, mournful tune, the same tune Sarah had heard at the bus terminal. It was a signal. From the shadows of the surrounding trees, 3 more figures emerged. They were dressed in the same tattered bus driver uniforms, their faces hidden behind cracked plastic masks. Sarah wasn't facing one killer, she was facing a pack. The masked figures moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. They didn't speak, they only circled the clearing, cutting off every possible exit. Sarah felt the walls of the forest closing in. The driver, the leader, stepped forward, leaving Emily by the fire. "Every year, the last bus brings a gift," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "The city forgets, the police stop looking, but the road always provides." He reached for a heavy iron chain hanging from the side of the rusted school bus. The sound of the metal links clinking together was like a death knell. He was preparing to bind her. Sarah's hand closed around the small pocket knife again. She knew she couldn't fight them all. She had to do something desperate. She looked at the campfire, then at the half-open fuel tank of a nearby car, an old sedan leaking a dark, pungent fluid. If she could create a distraction, she might have a chance to grab Emily and run. But Emily was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the fire, as if she were already dead inside. "Emily, please," Sarah whispered one last time, a silent prayer. The leader raised the chain, the heavy link swinging like a pendulum, ready to strike. Just as the leader lunged, Sarah threw her backpack into the center of the campfire. The aerosol can of dry shampoo she kept in the side pocket exploded with a deafening bang, sending a fountain of sparks and orange flame into the air. The masked figures recoiled, startled by the sudden blast. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dove toward the leaking sedan, struck her lighter, and tossed it into the pool of gasoline. A wall of fire erupted between her and the killers, the heat so intense it singed her eyebrows. In the chaos, she grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the dark tree line. Emily stumbled, her movements sluggish and confused. "Run, Emily, run!" Sarah screamed over the roar of the fire. They plunged into the thicket, the thorns tearing at their skin. Behind them, the driver was screaming, not in pain, but in a raw, guttural rage. The sound was animalistic, a howl that echoed through the pine barrens, shaking the very leaves on the trees. Sarah could hear the masked figures crashing through the brush behind them. They were fast, and they didn't need light to hunt. They followed the scent of fear. Sarah's heart was drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They reached a steep embankment, the ground giving way to a ravine filled with jagged rocks and freezing water. Sarah looked back. The orange glow of the fire was fading, replaced by the flickering beams of high-powered flashlights cutting through the trees. The hunters were closing the gap. Emily suddenly stopped, pulling her hand away from Sarah's. She looked at the ravine, then back at the lights. For the first time, a look of genuine terror appeared on her face. He doesn't let anyone go," Emily whispered, her voice finally sounding like the sister Sarah remembered. "If he can't have us, he'll bury us here."
"I won't let him," Sarah vowed, grabbing Emily again. They slid down the embankment, the cold mud soaking through their clothes. At the bottom, a narrow creek rushed over smooth stones. Sarah saw something glinting in the moonlight. A road. A real paved road, barely visible through the trees on the other side of the water. It was the highway. If they could reach it, they could flag down a car. They scrambled through the water, the ice-cold temperature stealing their breath. They reached the asphalt just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the midnight fog. Sarah ran to the center of the road, waving her arms frantically. The vehicle slowed down, a large, dark shape looming out of the mist. As it came to a halt, Sarah felt a surge of pure relief. It was a police cruiser. The blue and red lights began to flash, casting a strobe-like rhythm over the wet road. An officer stepped out, his silhouette tall and commanding. "Help us, please!" Sarah cried, collapsing to her knees. The officer walked toward them, his boots clicking on the pavement. But as he stepped into the light, Sarah's heart stopped. On his shoulder was the same patch she had seen on the driver's stolen uniform. The officer didn't reach for his radio to call for backup. Instead, he reached for his belt and turned off the flashing lights.
The road was plunged back into a suffocating natural darkness. Sarah stared at the patch on his arm, a silver bus wheel entwined with a serpent. It was the logo of the defunct Valley Transit Line, the same company that owned the Nightmare bus. The officer looked down at Sarah and Emily with a cold, detached expression. "You girls shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice devoid of any professional warmth. "The late-night route is strictly for those who have nowhere left to go." Sarah tried to scramble to her feet, but her muscles were locked in a state of shock. The officer didn't pull a gun. He pulled a heavy, weighted baton. Behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps approached from the tree line. The driver emerged, panting, his face a mask of dried blood and sweat. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked relieved. He nodded to the officer. "Thanks, Miller. The younger one is a fighter. Almost burned down the collection." The man Sarah thought was a savior was actually the gatekeeper. They were part of a network, a predatory system hiding in plain sight.
"Put them in the back of the cruiser," the driver commanded. The officer, Miller, grabbed Sarah by the collar, dragging her toward the car. Sarah looked back at Emily, who was standing still, her eyes fixed on the driver. Emily didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply walked toward the driver as if she were a ghost returning to its grave. "Emily, no!" Sarah choked out, but a heavy blow from the baton to her ribs silenced her. Everything went gray. The last thing she heard was the static of the police radio, a voice on the other end asking, "Is the cargo secured for the final stop?"
Sarah awoke to the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. Her head throbbed, and the copper taste of blood filled her mouth. She wasn't in the police car anymore. She was back on a bus, not the one from before, but a much older, windowless transport vehicle. It felt like a rolling coffin. Beside her, Emily sat staring at her own hands. The bus was moving fast, swaying through sharp turns. Sarah realized they weren't on the highway anymore. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decaying fish. They were heading toward the coast, toward the abandoned shipping yards of the Jersey Shore. The bus finally hissed to a stop. The doors opened, and a blast of frigid, salty air hit Sarah's face. They were on a pier that stretched out into the black Atlantic. Several other bus drivers were there, standing in a circle under a single flickering lamp. In the center of the pier sat a massive shipping container, its doors hanging open like a hungry mouth. Sarah saw movement inside, the shadows of dozens of people, huddled together in silence. This wasn't just about one killer or one bus. This was a terminal for a human trafficking ring that used the forgotten transit routes of America as their hunting grounds. The driver who had hunted them through the woods stepped forward, holding a heavy iron shackle. He looked at Sarah with a twisted sense of pride. You see, Sarah, no one is ever truly lost. They just get rerouted. He reached for her arm, but Sarah saw a flicker of movement behind him. Emily had picked up a flare gun from the bus's open emergency kit. Her eyes weren't vacant anymore. They were burning with a cold, hard clarity. Before the driver could react, Emily pulled the trigger. The flare hit the driver square in the chest, erupting in a blinding crimson light.
The pier exploded into chaos. The red phosphorus burned bright and hot, setting the driver's stolen uniform ablaze. He screamed, a high-pitched wail that was swallowed by the crashing waves. The other men scrambled, but the flare's smoke created a thick, red fog. "Run, Sarah!" Emily shouted, her voice stronger than it had been in years. She grabbed Sarah's hand and didn't head for the woods. She headed for the water. "We can't outrun them on land. We have to go." Behind them, the officer, Miller, pulled his service weapon and began firing blindly into the red mist. The water was an icy shock that threatened to stop Sarah's heart. They swam under the pier, clinging to the barnacle-encrusted pilings as bullets splintered the wood inches above their heads. The current was strong, pulling them away from the shore and into the vast, indifferent ocean. Sarah looked back and saw the pier engulfed in a strange red glow. The shipping container was being closed, the drivers trying to hide their evidence. But the fire from the flare had spread to the bus's fuel line. A second later, a massive explosion rocked the pier, sending a fireball into the midnight sky.
The two sisters drifted for what felt like hours, clinging to a piece of floating debris from the explosion. The salt water stung their wounds, and the cold was turning their limbs to stone. Just as Sarah felt her grip slipping, she saw a light, not a flickering lamp or a killer's flashlight, but the steady, rotating beam of a Coast Guard cutter. She tried to shout, but her throat was too dry. She used her last bit of strength to splash the water. The beam swung toward them, hesitated, and then locked on to their figures. They had been found, but the nightmare was far from over.
2 days later, Sarah woke up in a hospital in Atlantic City. Her hands were bandaged, and a police guard, a real one this time, stood outside her door. The FBI had been called in. As she told her story, the agents grew paler. They had been investigating the ghost routes for a decade, but they never had a survivor. They found the pier, or what was left of it. They found the charred remains of the bus and the driver, but the shipping container, it was gone. And the officer named Miller, he had vanished, his house scrubbed clean of any evidence.
The investigation revealed a terrifying truth. The Valley Transit Line hadn't just gone bankrupt. It had been bought by a shell company with ties to international syndicates. They used the old, unmonitored bus stops in rural Pennsylvania and New Jersey to pick up the invisibles. Travelers, runaways, and students, people no one would miss for days. The bus Sarah boarded wasn't a mistake, it was a scheduled pickup. The driver wasn't just a madman, he was an employee of a system that processed humans like freight. The scale of the operation was beyond anything the public could imagine. Emily remained in a psychiatric ward, her mind a fragile web of trauma and recovery. Sometimes she would speak of others, the people she saw in the shipping container, the regulars who lived in the graveyard of coaches. She told the FBI about a ledger the driver kept, a book of names and final destinations. When the authorities searched the Pine Barrens graveyard, they found it buried under the campfire. It contained over 200 names. Most were marked with a simple, chilling stamp, delivered. Sarah's name had been written on the last page, the ink still fresh.
The last bus ride case became a national sensation. But the deeper the authorities dug, the more roadblocks they hit. Small-town officials, transit authorities, and even local police departments seemed to have lost records. The corruption went deeper than a few crooked cops. It was a parasitic industry fed by the silence of the American highways. Sarah tried to return to her normal life, but the sound of a diesel engine or the hiss of air brakes now sent her into a paralyzing panic. She realized that for some people, the bus ride never truly ends.
A year later, Sarah received an anonymous envelope in the mail. Inside was a single grainy photograph. It was a picture of a bus stop in a different state, Ohio. Standing under the flickering light was a man in a silver-gray uniform, his face obscured by a low-brimmed cap. In his hand he held a small silver locket. Sarah's heart turned to lead. The driver from the pier was dead, but the route was still open. The system had simply replaced its parts. The ghost routes were still active, and the last bus was still making its rounds.
Tonight, as you sit in your room or drive down a lonely stretch of highway, look at the person in the seat across from you. If you're waiting for the late-night bus, pay attention to the driver's hands. Check the logo on the side of the coach. Because in the vast, dark stretches of the American night, there are roads that don't appear on any map. And once the doors hiss shut behind you, there may be no more stops until the very end. Sleep well if you can, but remember, never ever take the last bus home.